There are moments in life when you open your front door expecting a breeze of fresh morning air, and instead, get smacked in the face with a letter so absurd it feels like a prank from the universe. That was exactly how it started. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, slippers still on, staring at the rising sun and listening to the sound of birds when a plain white envelope wedged into the door caught my eye. I knew that envelope. It had the look of something dipped in passive aggression and seasoned with fake authority. Oh, 3 letters that could ruin anyone's day. I opened it without ceremony, already bracing for nonsense. And, oh boy, did it deliver. Apparently, my home, my peaceful corner lot sanctuary, had become a source of discomfort and repeated disturbance due to a continuous influx of non-resident individuals whose presence disrupts the intended tranquility of the neighborhood. That's HOA speak for, your friends come over, and we don't like it. I laughed out loud, not a chuckle, but a deep, body-shaking laugh that startled my neighbor's cat from across the fence. My friends, God bless them, are a bunch of retired old-timers who spend more time talking about their knees than actually bending them. We sit on my porch, sip tea, swap construction horror stories, and occasionally toss peanuts at the squirrels like it's a sport. Disruption? The only thing being disrupted is their own boredom. But there it was in black and white, a warning to regulate my visitors or face fines. Fines for having people over? I didn't think things could get worse until she showed up. Karen. If you ever wanted a person to embody the HOA spirit like a villain in a Hallmark movie gone rogue, Karen was it. Blonde bob, pressed slacks, and a clipboard that she held like a sheriff's badge. She came marching up my front steps like she owned the pavement. I greeted her with my usual sarcasm and the widest smile I could muster, which seemed to only deepen the permanent wrinkle in her forehead. She didn't waste time, told me my guests were violating neighborhood visitor policy, that long-term parking by non-residents wasn't permitted, and that multiple complaints had been filed. No doubt by the same 3 people who spent their days spying through their curtains like underpaid extras in a spy film. I asked her if she wanted to meet the alleged criminals. At that very moment, my old buddy, Hank, came outside in mismatched socks and a kiss the contractor apron, holding a plate of burned toast and waving like a child. Karen didn't crack a smile. That man has been here 3 times this week, she snapped. This isn't a social club. I looked her dead in the eye and said, Karen, we're retired. Social clubs are all we've got left. That didn't help. She handed me a second letter, this one more aggressively worded than the first, and warned me that continued violation would result in escalating fines, potential legal action, and the possibility of having my guest privileges revoked entirely. Guest privileges in my own house? Was this a country club or a suburban dictatorship? The moment she left, I sat back down with my coffee and stared at the paper in disbelief. They were serious. They actually wanted to tell me who could and couldn't visit my own property. That's when the anger started to simmer. Not the explosive kind, but the slow burning, you picked the wrong guy kind. I knew then that this wasn't going to end with a couple of strongly worded letters. They were challenging my space, my peace, my people. Later that afternoon, when the gang came over, Hank, Lou, Sam, and Charlie, I told them everything. They burst out laughing. Lou offered to show up every day just to annoy Karen. Sam said, we should build a gazebo and start hosting poker night. Charlie, who hadn't spoken in 3 weeks, simply muttered, time to have some fun. But none of their reactions compared to my dad's. That night, I called him. Now, my dad is a legend, 70 years old, retired foreman, still sharp enough to slice granite with a stare. Built half the housing developments around this county back in his day, including the one we live in now. He listened quietly as I told him about Karen and her clipboard crusade. And then he laughed, one of those deep, wicked, old-school laughs that told me trouble was brewing. Son, he said, you remember that time in '89 when the inspector tried to shut down the Johnson job site because he didn't like the noise level? I smiled. You rerouted the dump trucks to drive past his house at 5 a.m. every morning for 2 weeks. He chuckled. Exactly. People like that need to be reminded where the real power lies. You don't let someone with a laminated badge run your life. That was all I needed to hear. I knew the spark in his voice meant he was already formulating a plan. And once he got involved, things didn't just get even, they got entertaining. I went to bed that night with a strange kind of excitement, the kind you get when you know a storm's coming, but you've got the best front row seat and a cooler full of beer. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. If they wanted a problem, they'd get one. Not through yelling, not through lawsuits, but through strategy. through perfectly legal, delightfully annoying, passive-aggressive warfare. And at the center of it all, my old man, a retired construction boss with too much free time and a long memory. The HOA thought they were dealing with just another retiree. They didn't know they had awakened a sleeping bulldozer. Karen may have had her rules, her forms, her policies, but we had tools, experience, and a whole lot of retired mischief to unleash. And for the first time in a long time, I felt young again. Let the games begin. By the time Saturday rolled around, my old man pulled into the driveway with the confidence of a man who'd just been asked to wage war and given the perfect excuse to have fun doing it. He stepped out of his pickup in his usual uniform, worn boots, faded jeans, and a flannel shirt with sleeves rolled halfway up his arms. His hard hat sat in the passenger seat like it was waiting to clock in. He didn't even knock, just walked into my house, tossed his keys on the counter, and asked, "All right, where are we building this revolution?" I explained the HOA's supposed legal authority to restrict non-resident visitors, their passive-aggressive letters, and Karen's smug threat. My dad listened, didn't interrupt, and nodded slowly like a general surveying the battlefield. Then he opened a notebook, flipped to a blank page, and began sketching. We need noise. We need clutter. We need something that technically qualifies as construction, but isn't really construction. You know what that means, right? I stared at him, half expecting him to suggest building a moat. Scaffolding, he said, tapping the pen like it was a judge's gavel. Nothing screams civil disobedience like a house wrapped in steel pipes for no reason. I blinked. You want to cover my house in scaffolding? He grinned. Just a section, maybe two. We'll make it look like we're reinforcing the front awning. Nobody can question it, but it'll make Karen's little kingdom nervous. Best part is, it's not permanent. We can shift it around as needed. Call it adjustments or inspections. Then he leaned in like he was about to tell me the secret to immortality. Plus, it drives people nuts. Within hours, Frank had made a few calls to his old crew. Retired? Yes. Rusty? Maybe. But they still had the gear and knew how to stir the pot. By lunchtime, 3 more trucks were parked along my curb. I could practically feel Karen's binoculars shaking in disbelief. Out came the scaffolding, wheelbarrows, toolboxes, folding sawhorses, and a generator that sounded like it had beef with the entire HOA board. They set up a line of bright orange cones and installed a caution, maintenance in progress sign that my dad proudly nailed to my mailbox. We didn't just build scaffolding. We built anticipation, loudly, with banter and fake arguments over imaginary blueprints, all staged to make the operation seem more serious than it was. Hank pretended to argue with Lou over support beams. Sam walked around measuring random patches of dirt. Charlie paced the sidewalk, scribbling nothing in a clipboard. It was theater, and we were Shakespeare with tool belts. Karen came by twice that day. The first time, she stood across the street, hands on hips, glaring like a hawk with a superiority complex. The second time, she marched right up to the house and demanded an explanation. My dad met her halfway up the lawn, whistling cheerfully as he wiped fake sweat from his brow. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, tipping his imaginary hat. "We're just conducting a structural reinforcement. You know how these older homes are. Things settle, cracks form. Got to be proactive." He said it with such professional authority that even I almost believed we were fixing something. Karen narrowed her eyes. "This construction wasn't approved. You didn't file a modification request." My dad tilted his head. "Didn't realize I needed permission to protect the safety of my son's home. Wouldn't want anything collapsing. Liability and all that." It was her turn to blink. She started to say something but paused, clearly unsure whether she had grounds to stop us. My dad had played the safety card. That's HOA kryptonite. Karen turned on her heel and stormed off, her face a beautiful shade of HOA panic beige. We knew she'd be back, probably with backup. The next day, we escalated. My dad brought in a cement mixer, not to pour anything, but just to park it on the lawn and fire it up every now and then for realism. We added more cones, a work zone banner, and started taking measurements of my mailbox, which drove Karen absolutely wild. We called it the Phase 2 illusion, pretend to plan for something big and mysterious so they waste time trying to figure it out. Meanwhile, we're doing absolutely nothing, just being loud, present, and delightfully within our rights. The neighbors began noticing. Some were annoyed, sure, but others? They brought lawn chairs. Mr. Patel from down the street brought popcorn and sat across the street every afternoon like it was a backyard soap opera. One teenage kid live-streamed the setup on social media with the caption, "Old dudes trolling the HOA." Legends, views skyrocketed. We were viral in the most unexpected way. That night, after a long day of work, we sat around the fire pit in my backyard, sipping beer and laughing until our ribs hurt. My dad looked happier than I'd seen him in years. He was back in his element, commanding, sharp, stirring chaos with surgical precision. "You see, son," he said between sips, "some people retire and play golf. Me? I build petty wars and monuments of irritation." I laughed and shook my head. "They're going to lose their minds." He nodded solemnly. "They already have. They just don't know it yet." But beneath the laughter, I felt something deeper settling in. This wasn't just about annoying the HOA anymore. It was about reclaiming a sense of freedom, about proving that you didn't have to be young and loud to fight back. Sometimes the most dangerous rebels are the ones who've already lived through life's toughest battles and came out the other side with nothing left to prove, but everything to protect. The letters from the HOA kept coming. Karen even tried to cite a noise violation, but the community wasn't on her side anymore. We hadn't broken any laws. We hadn't blocked any roads. And every time they tried to slap us with a rule, we countered with a technicality. My dad, bless him, had printed out the entire HOA charter and carried it in a binder. Every clause, every loophole, every contradictory line. He treated it like a playbook, grinning as he flipped through the pages. The pressure was mounting. Karen wasn't just angry now. She was flustered, desperate to regain control of her tiny empire. But the more she pushed, the more ridiculous she looked. And we were just getting started. It didn't take long for the HOA to crack. The third letter came hand-delivered by Karen herself, sealed with so many stamps and stickers you'd think it was a presidential decree. She didn't bother with pleasantries this time. No fake smile, no clipped "good afternoon." Just a stiff arm holding the envelope like it was radioactive, and a scowl carved, so deep it looked permanent. I opened the letter right there on the porch while she stood waiting like a referee, daring me to argue with the whistle. The letter was a formal cease and desist order regarding all unauthorized construction activity, complete with vague threats of legal action, mentions of bylaws, and an overly dramatic phrase about threats to community cohesion. I read it aloud like I was performing Shakespeare in the park, hamming it up for my dad, who stood nearby polishing a wrench that hadn't touched a bolt in days. Karen interrupted before I could finish, pointing at the fake construction sign with the kind of fury usually reserved for wild raccoons. "You're creating chaos in this neighborhood," she snapped. "People are uncomfortable. This isn't a construction site. This is a circus." My dad stepped forward, not missing a beat. "Glad you noticed. We were thinking of charging admission." Karen's jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might fuse. She stormed off, and I knew that was the last polite visit we'd get. Sure enough, 2 days later, we got the big guns. An email from the HOA's legal counsel, complete with a PDF attachment of the HOA's rule book, highlighted sections, and a fancy digital signature. My dad laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. "They brought a lawyer into a neighborhood spat? That's how you know we're winning." We weren't about to roll over. Instead, we doubled down. The next morning, Frank called in an old buddy from his contracting days, Earl, who once worked as a zoning inspector and had a memory like a steel trap. Earl went through the HOA's legal nonsense line by line and grinned. "They're bluffing," he said. "Their bylaws contradict city ordinances in 3 places. You've got more legal footing than they do." Frank's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Then let's make 'em dance." That week, we expanded the chaos. We added a second scaffolding rig around the garage and posted a laminated schedule outside labeled Reinforcement Phase 2. Earl even made us an official-looking sign with a construction permit number. Totally fake, of course, but impressive enough to confuse any nosy neighbors. We ran the generator twice a day just to keep the noise level consistent. Hank started wearing a neon vest and directing non-existent traffic at the end of the driveway. Sam brought in a wheelbarrow and filled it with bricks he never intended to use. Every movement was precise, pointless, and entirely legal. Karen tried to rally support from other neighbors, but it backfired. Turns out, a lot of folks had bones to pick with the HOA. Mr. and Mrs. Castillo had been fined last year for using the wrong color of mulch. Bethany from 2 doors down had been written up for hanging wind chimes that violated auditory tranquility. And don't even get me started on the Christmas lights debacle of 2019. Our little protest sparked something bigger. A handful of neighbors came over with lemonade and chairs. Someone brought donuts. People started showing up just to watch the spectacle, treating our front lawn like a town square. It wasn't just rebellion anymore. It was entertainment. And that's when the HOA got desperate. The next morning, while we were adjusting a plank on the scaffolding just for show, two men in suits showed up. Real suits, tie pins, briefcases, the whole 9 yards. They introduced themselves as representatives from the HOA's external legal team. My dad, unfazed, invited them to sit down on folding chairs he unfolded right there on the lawn. They tried to speak in stern legal terms, rattling off words like non-compliance, civil liability, and enforcement measures. My dad just nodded along, flipping through his binder of HOA bylaws like a priest with a Bible. When they finished, he cleared his throat and hit them with a legal judo move so smooth I almost applauded. According to Section 4.6 of your own community regulations, temporary structural improvements for the purposes of maintenance do not require pre-approval, provided they do not impede access, block public utilities, or violate height restrictions. Would you like me to point out where our scaffolding meets all those criteria? Because I've got photos and measurements and, if I may say, excellent craftsmanship. The suits were stunned. They mumbled something about further review and walked off like two kids who just lost at chess to their grandpa. Karen, who had been hiding behind her curtain the whole time, peeked out and nearly screamed when she saw them leave without so much as a warning. The best part came that afternoon when a drone flew over our house. Someone, presumably Karen, was trying to gather evidence. My dad, ever the showman, stood dead center in the yard and waved up at it with a huge grin, wearing a hard hat and holding blueprints upside down. I couldn't stop laughing. Even the mailman paused to snap a photo. But in the middle of all this madness, something else was happening. People were talking to each other again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were laughing together. Kids were riding their bikes around the cones. Retired folks brought their dogs and stayed to chat. It was like we'd broken the spell of HOA fear. People weren't hiding anymore. My dad noticed it too. One night, as we sat on the porch sipping iced tea, he said, "This started as a fight, but I think we built something better." I nodded, watching a group of kids play tag around the fake construction zone. He smiled. Karen wanted control, but we gave people freedom. Of course, we weren't stupid. We knew the HOA wasn't done yet. They were backed into a corner, and desperate people do silly things. But by now, we weren't just fighting for my right to have visitors. We were fighting for the spirit of the neighborhood, for the right to exist without being micromanaged by someone with a clipboard and a superiority complex. And we weren't alone anymore. Still, none of us were prepared for what the HOA would try next. When the envelope arrived marked Notice of Emergency Community Board Hearing, we knew they were pulling out the big guns. But by that point, it wasn't just my dad and I. It was the whole block, and we were ready. When the envelope came, it looked more dramatic than usual, as if someone at the HOA office had finally unlocked the secret red alert stamp. It was thick too. Multiple pages, official formatting, and a bold title that practically screamed panic. Notice of Emergency Community Board Hearing. The date was set for that Friday evening, and the location was the HOA clubhouse, the very heart of Karen's empire. The letter claimed this hearing was to address ongoing disruptions, potential violations of community integrity, and refusal to cooperate with governing bodies. I showed it to my dad, who read the entire thing without blinking, then calmly folded it up and slid it into his back pocket like it was a grocery list. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he looked at me and said, "They're going to throw everything they've got at us." And they did. The night of the meeting, the parking lot was full. Cars lined the street. People were standing outside the clubhouse doors, talking in low murmurs, half excited, half anxious. The word had spread fast. Some came for the drama. Others came because they were tired of Karen's reign of passive-aggressive tyranny. Frank and I arrived early, mostly so we could claim a good seat near the front. My dad wore his best flannel shirt tucked into his jeans, steel-toed boots freshly cleaned, and the same leather jacket he'd worn to job sites for 30 years. He looked like he was about to bid on a $1 million contract, not sit through a suburban tribunal. Inside, the clubhouse was set up like a courtroom, or at least what Karen thought a courtroom should look like. A long table at the front with HOA board members lined up in a row, clipboards in hand. Karen sat dead center, eyes sharp, posture stiff, with a microphone in front of her like she was about to conduct a Senate hearing. The crowd filled every seat, the tension thick as concrete. Everyone was waiting for the show to start. Karen opened with a speech that sounded rehearsed, dramatic, and completely devoid of self-awareness. She spoke of community values, order, harmony, and how one resident's refusal to comply with the rules had triggered an unfortunate wave of rebellion. She didn't say my name, but her eyes burned holes through me every time she spoke of disruption. The other board members nodded solemnly, though a few looked more like they wanted to disappear into their folding chairs. Then she dropped the hammer. She read a motion to issue formal sanctions against me, fines for noise violations, unauthorized construction, and repeated non-compliance with visitor regulations. She proposed banning me from hosting any non-residents for a period of 90 days. 90 days. My own friends, neighbors, and even my father, all banned because Karen didn't like the way our conversations sounded from her porch. There was a stunned silence after she finished reading. She leaned back, smug, sure she'd won. Then Frank stood up. He didn't raise his voice, didn't yell, or wave his arms. He just started talking, calm, measured, but every word hit like a brick. He talked about the absurdity of regulating human connection, about how punishing someone for having guests was a violation not just of common sense, but of basic decency. He recounted the ridiculous letters, the escalating threats, and how every one of them had been countered with calm, measured, and legal resistance. Then he pulled out the binder. He walked slowly to the front table, opened it, and began reading from the HOA's own rule book. Page after page, every bylaw Karen had twisted, every contradiction they'd overlooked, every loophole they'd hoped no one would notice. He laid them out one by one, clear as daylight. At one point, he even handed a copy of his findings to one of the board members, who began flipping through the pages with a pale look on his face. Frank wasn't done. He looked around the room and told everyone what they already knew but hadn't dared to say. That the HOA had gone too far, that people were tired of being monitored, reported, and fined for living their lives, that what started as rules meant to protect the community had morphed into tools of control wielded by people who mistook power for purpose. The room was quiet, but the energy had shifted. You could feel it. The balance had tipped. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, other residents stood up. Bethany shared her story about the wind chimes. The Castillos talked about the mulch fine. Mr. Patel spoke about being reprimanded for planting vegetables instead of decorative flowers. It became a chorus, a wave, a breaking dam of frustration that had been building for years. Karen tried to interrupt, to regain control, but it was too late. The flood had started, and no clipboard in the world could stop it. The board members looked overwhelmed. Even the most loyal ones couldn't ignore the sheer volume of voices rising in unison. Finally, one of them, a quiet man named Dennis, cleared his throat and asked if there was any actual bylaw that prohibited what I had been doing. Karen stammered, said something about spirit of the community, but Dennis pressed again. Not the spirit, the actual rule. She couldn't answer. The vote was held. The motion to sanction me was denied. Unanimously. Karen's face froze, her eyes wide, lips tight, as if the entire foundation of her HOA dominion had just cracked beneath her heels. People clapped. Not all, but enough. And the ones who didn't looked quietly satisfied. My dad leaned over and whispered, "Told you." They always overplay their hand. After the meeting, people gathered in the parking lot, talking, laughing, some still in disbelief. My dad was treated like a celebrity. Handshakes, pats on the back, offers to help with the next phase of construction. Someone even joked about electing him HOA president. He declined. Of course, said he preferred working without a title. Karen left without a word, slipping out the side door while everyone was distracted. Her kingdom had crumbled, not with a bang, but with the sound of community rediscovering its voice. We drove home in silence for a while, both of us tired but satisfied. Then my dad chuckled and said, "They thought they were fighting a grumpy old man. Turns out they were messing with a crew." That night, I looked out at the scaffolding still standing in the yard. It was ridiculous, theatrical, and completely unnecessary, but it had served its purpose. It reminded everyone, including me, that sometimes the only way to deal with nonsense is to outplay it with wit, grit, and a little bit of noise. And if you can do that while sipping tea with your old man, well, then maybe the fight was worth it after all. The morning after the hearing, everything felt still. Not the eerie kind of still, but the kind that follows a thunderstorm, when the sky scrubbed clean and the air smells like fresh chances. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun inch across the roof of the fake construction zone we'd built over the last few weeks. The scaffolding was still there, the cones still standing, the caution signs fluttering in the breeze like victory flags. My dad joined me a minute later, carrying his mug like a trophy. He sipped, exhaled, and said, "Well, son, I think we just won the quietest war in HOA history." The neighborhood was different now. You could feel it in the way people walked, Looser shoulders, longer conversations, laughter that didn't feel like it had to whisper behind hedges. The Castillo kids zoomed by on scooters, waving at us like we were neighborhood royalty. Bethany dropped off a thank you basket filled with baked goods and homemade coupons that said things like one free scaffolding adjustment and legal advice, not legally binding. We kept them all on the fridge like badges of honor. Even the grumpier neighbors, the ones who'd stayed on the fence through the whole ordeal, started nodding a little more politely when they passed. And Karen? She disappeared. Not literally, of course, but she retreated. The clipboard patrol stopped. The snarky notices vanished from mailboxes. Even the HOA newsletter arrived with a suspiciously softer tone, suddenly filled with phrases like community feedback and open dialogue. Word had it she stepped down from her role as head enforcer, claiming she needed personal time to reflect. I imagined her sitting at home with a notepad full of unfinished rules, wondering where it all went wrong. But the truth is, it didn't go wrong. It just finally went right. My dad, never one to waste a perfectly good opportunity for mischief, decided we shouldn't let the scaffolding go to waste. We built a symbol, he said. Might as well turn it into something useful. So we converted part of it into a raised garden bed, brought in wooden planks, flower pots, and even strung some lights through the rails. It looked ridiculous and charming all at once, like a retired contractor's version of a Pinterest project. The neighbors loved it. Kids helped plant sunflowers. Retired folks came by to offer watering schedules. Someone brought a gnome. We named him Gerald and gave him a hard hat. The yard became a gathering place. People came to swap stories, share leftovers, or just sit and enjoy the breeze. It wasn't just about standing up to the HOA anymore. It was about what we'd built in the process. A space where people weren't afraid to talk, to laugh, to be seen. And in a neighborhood where silence used to be the safest answer, that was no small thing. One afternoon, a city inspector showed up, a real one this time, badge and clipboard included. Said he'd gotten a complaint about unauthorized construction. I almost rolled my eyes. Karen Swan's song, no doubt. But before I could launch into defense mode, the inspector smiled and said, "Relax. I'm not here to shut anything down. Honestly, I just had to see it for myself. My uncle lives 2 blocks over." He chuckled. "Your dad's turning HOA complaints into performance art." Then he took a photo with Gerald the gnome and left. And just like that, our nonsense had officially reached legend status. A few weeks later, the HOA hosted a reconciliation barbecue at the park, which was their way of waving the white flag without admitting it. They sent out flyers, apologized for past miscommunications, and invited everyone to bring a dish. I brought coleslaw. My dad brought a folding table with a small sign that said, "Free advice. How not to get bulldozed." It was a hit. Even the board members cracked a few smiles. Dennis, the quiet guy who'd spoken up at the hearing, pulled me aside and said, "You know, you didn't just fix a problem. You reminded us we're neighbors, not employees." That one stuck with me. My friends still came by, of course, more than ever actually. Friday nights became a tradition. We'd gather on the porch, swap stories, play cards, and joke about forming an unofficial old dudes resistance club. Hank started bringing his guitar. Sam finally learned how to cook something that wasn't charcoal. Charlie, in a rare burst of enthusiasm, bought us all matching hats that said, "Retired but dangerous." My dad wore his everywhere, even to the grocery store. Said it was better than a name tag. But somewhere beneath the laughter and inside jokes, something quieter settled in. Pride. Not the loud, boastful kind. The kind that fills you up slowly, like warm soup on a cold day. I was proud of what we did. Proud of standing up. Proud of the fact that my dad, even in retirement, could outsmart, outmaneuver, and outlast an entire bureaucratic regime armed with nothing but a binder and a lifetime of grit. One night, just after sunset, I sat with him out back by the fire pit. We didn't talk much, just watched the flames dance and listened to the cicadas. Then he said, "You know, when I first showed up here, I figured we'd just give them a little grief, have some fun. But I didn't expect all this." He waved a hand toward the garden, the scaffolding now strung with fairy lights, the porch full of laughter. I forgot what it felt like to matter to people who aren't blood. I nodded. I think we all did. And that really was the twist none of us saw coming. We didn't just fight back. We woke something up, a sleepy little neighborhood shaken out of its HOA-induced coma and reminded that being a community meant more than following rules. It meant connection, shared stories, a little noise, and maybe a few ridiculous hard hats along the way. Eventually, we did take the scaffolding down. Left the garden, though. Gerald stayed too, wearing sunglasses now because someone decided he needed a vacation vibe. Life went on, peacefully but never quietly. And that was the best part. Because now, every laugh, every late-night porch story, every kid's shout or dog's bark, it all sounded like freedom. And if the HOA ever tried to pull something again, well, the hard hats were in the garage, the binder was updated, and the crew, always ready.